remember when I saw you on Alyssa's show on the Alyssa Children's podcast discussing your journey. You referenced how your background played a big role as far as your upbringing. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Yeah, so I went to a high school that so first, man, my stepfather was black.
Hmm.
He took me in. Well, him and my mother met when I was 3 years old, I think, and so he's my dad. You know, I didn't have a category for him as my stepdad until I got older.
Right.
So dad brought me in, and I lived in an urban community, and there was maybe three white people that went to my school. I
Oh
didn't have
wow.
anything against white people, but you know, my interactions with white people was the cops primarily,
Mm,
and I grew up in the time of Biggie and Pac, and that genre of music, and so my philosophy about the cops was negative, to
right.
say the least. Um, and I had two parents, but they weren't Christians. I wasn't raised in a Christian home. I wasn't a bad kid, but I found trouble. Trouble found me,
Right.
and yeah. So having so anyway, I grew up in a school where it was predominantly black, mainly Caribbean, and also what's it called, Mexican and El Salvadorian, and so there's all that, right?
Yeah.
And with those kind of environments, so I was it's funny, I was just looking at my yearbook the other day, and I was looking at the heightened pro blackness that we were taught by way. And again, hey, nothing wrong with appreciating your culture, nothing wrong
Right.
with appreciating your background and all that, but there was this air of oppression. There was this air of we got to grind through the oppression, and there was never like an empowerment through education for me. Now there were
Hmm.
others, who excelled well during that time, but those were usually people who were like in the suburban areas,
Right.
people outside of that who just got a bad lot in life, not being raised in a suburban area. They just really, it was like woe is me kind of mentality.
Yeah.
Um, you know, so that was kind of my upbringing. That was like the air I breathed, to use woke language.
Right.
It,
Right.
it
Right.
was it was the air I breathed.
So you grew up. So you said you're 42,
I'm 42, or going on 42.
going up
Yep.
42. So you're talking. So we're talking. We talking about like mid to late 90s as far as
Yep.
like some of your high school and things like that.
Yep.
That
I
time.
graduated 2000. So
Yeah, I can think. Oh, okay. Yeah. So I can think back on when you talk about some of the Biggie and Tupac and whatnot. I can think back on just because I was just a young man at the time. Well, 2000, yeah, I was 30 years old. So I can think back on that time frame where a lot of cultural, as far as hip hop, the influence of hip hop has been going on pretty much since it
well,
debuted, as far as
yep.
how it impacted society, and it just continued to grow more and more as time went on. Like I can remember when Rappers Delight first came out when I was in New Jersey, listening to, probably, I'm trying to think of the radio station. You probably know it, maybe WBLS. I don't even know
Okay.
if they're still active up in New York. But I remember the day it debuted, it came out. I was like, "Okay, what is this?" Like, I was just like, What is this?" But then, as the years went on, the impact that it had. When I was in the army in late '80s, when gangster rap came out, I was just really turned off on that because I wasn't raised in the hood. I had lived in the hood for a while when my dad brought us all to South Carolina, and the gangster rap and glorifying the shooting, all the cussing and whatnot. I wasn't down with that, man, because most of the guys I listened to really didn't do much of that. It was almost like the message of the street.
Mhm.
There, when people were really giving a lot of pushback about them perceived glorification of violence, and I would say to some degree the truthful glorification of violence. I remember Ice Cube and Easy E and Dre and all them guys would always say that this is just the life that we live. This is just our experiences. So I say all that to say, when you talk about Tupac and Biggie and those cats right there, it's
Pu-
like,
Public. I mean, remember
oh,
Public Enemy.
right,
I
right.
remember, whoop whoop. That's the sound of the police. Like I just
Yeah, yeah.
remember, like that was the mind. I remember, man. Where and this is the thing, man. I was doing wrong things and hanging out with wrong people, right? So I was
Right.
smoking weed and I was skipping school and in relationships I shouldn't have been in. And I remember one time, man, we're walking down the block and one of my friends, we had just cut school and one of my friends flick off the cops and the cops turn
Mm.
right back around, have us sit on the ground, have us pull down our pants, like they was really giving us a hard time.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so did they go beyond what they should
Oh
have?
yeah.
Probably, right? Like,
No
yeah,
doubt.
but like we was knuckleheads, bro. Like we were very disrespectful to the cops. We were, but that kind of stuff was, my parents didn't teach me that.
Mm.
That was what I learned from my friends. That was what I learned from movies. I remember Boys in the Hood. I remember Menace to Society. Like that.
Right.
It's funny. I talk to my wife now, and she's like, my kids, they're into like Star Wars and things like that. And I was like, I've never seen any of those things because that wasn't my culture. My culture was Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society. So
Oh yeah. Oh
it's
yeah.
a
Oh
different
yeah.
world.
No, and you can understand, and I'm not justifying it at all, but when you're young and impressionable,
Mhm.
and you said you weren't raised in the church, you weren't raised to
Nope.
fear with the fear and in the fear and admonition of the Lord, your mind, it has a tendency to want to follow.
Yep.
I can recall, I always tell the story of when I was a young man, 13 years old, 12, 13, stealing from the local uh, convenience store and whatnot,
Yep.
and hanging out with my buddies. I just wanted to be accepted, so I did what
Yep.
they did.
And
And
it's funny. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
yeah, real quick, man. And the life that I went down, I could see the path that I was heading down. And then one summer, my mom realized that I had a bunch of magazines, and she knew my allowance was only $1.50 a week. And she was like, "How you get all these
Uh,
magazines? Where'd you get all this from?" And I tried to him and haw around the answer, but then finally I said I came clean and admitted it to her. She held that over my head the entire summer. And let me tell you something. How did she hold that over my head? She said, if you act up at all, I'm gonna tell your dad what you did." And
mm,
that was all I needed, because I knew the hammer would drop on me like never before if he found out that I was stealing. So I was an angel all summer long, but it
mhm.
was just the impact that he had, the role my dad had, that fear that I had in my father. I was like, man, I'm not doing this. I always tell people my life of crime was officially over at
Yes.
13 years old. I was done, bro. I was like, I
Yeah.
ain't doing that again, because if my dad finds that out, he'd probably take me down to the jailhouse himself and say, "Here you go. He's over here stealing." But
Yeah,
man,
man.
just that. But in the meantime, like I was saying, man, I was following after these knucklehead kids.
Yep.
My dad went to church, and this is a story in and of itself. My dad went to church, but it wasn't until we moved to South Carolina where he ever even wanted to take us. He never wanted to take us to church. And like I said, that's a story in and of itself. I think my dad was Papa, the old song, Papa was a Rolling Stone. That was my
Yep.
pops, unfortunately. And being real, man, being
Sure,
real.
yeah.
And but when we moved down to South Carolina, he wanted me to start going to church, and the rest of my siblings, but I didn't want to go then. I was like, I begged you to go when I was little, but it just demonstrates how easily a kid can be impacted by
Mhm.
their environment. Peer pressure is a mug. It really is. Peer pressure can be really strong.
Yeah, man, that's what I was gonna say is, a world a worldview, how you view the world is developed at a very early age. And
No
there
doubt.
there is a message that the world that God created is a world that is communicated through story and through narrative. And it's not just cognitively learning, but it's
Hmm.
also, how they say, like, some of the lessons you learn is not just taught but caught,
Yeah,
things
yeah.
you see. And so, like, for example, growing up, I remember thinking that the government was wicked, just plain out across the board. Like, and I didn't have like substantial evidence to come to that case. It was just, how could they not be? Like, look at how, people who look at the ghetto, look at how people are oppressed.
Right.
Look at this, look at that. So you have these. It's crazy, man. I didn't have categories for this, but I was I wasn't I didn't have like categories of Republican and Democrat, but
Yeah.
but my mindset was Democrat good, Republican evil. And the reason
Oh yeah.
why is, right, because Democrats help the poor people. Democrats help people who are oppressed, and Republicans help, rich people. And I'm not advocating for Republicanism. I'm definitely not advocating for, them being a Democrat. but But it's just there's things you see and you hear and you learn, and it becomes how it becomes a worldview, and it determines how you live your life. And
100%.
you may not be able to write it down and explain it as clearly as you would like to, or you think you could, but it's a worldview, and it starts very early in life.